This is House Planning Help episode 7.
Have you always wanted to build your dream home? Maybe you know what you want. But what if it could be better? HousePlanningHelp.com. Speaking to the experts, searching for better ways, planning for the future, build a better home. HousePlanningHelp.com podcast.
Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and in today's session, we're ditching the experts. What? No, you can't do that. Well, there is a reason, because we're taking a look at things from the client's perspective. My guest is Tahir Sharif, who's about to move into his new home, and I go back to the future. Time circuit set to 1981.
HousePlanningHelp.com.
Welcome, and no time travelling, sadly, much as I would like to do that, but I did get a blast from the past. It was connected to what I'm doing, trying to build up my knowledge, going to see as many different house builds as possible. If there's a talk on insulation or whatever it might be, I'd get along there. I want to build up my knowledge. So this was an opportunity in Milton Keynes, albeit I didn't read the blurb very well. So I thought I was going to this property from the 1980s that had now been retrofitted up to great energy efficiency standards. But I was wrong, because in Milton Keynes, it's quite a new city. And they had this exhibition in 1981 called Homeworld, and it brought together loads of brilliant minds from across the world to try and think, well, where should housing be going? And so we were in this property that had pretty much the approach that I think people are starting to realise. If we want to save money, save energy, this is the way to go. The really good insulation, the air tightness, good quality windows, a ventilation system, all of these things combined. Perhaps not to the levels that we have now, but it was a demonstration model from 1981. And here we are, over 30 years down the line, and we're still just getting started on this, really. So it was crazy to see that. And so I want to do a bit more research into this. There's not an awful lot on the internet. They had another exhibition, I think it was either late 80s or early 90s, called Future World. And I think we need to learn some bits and pieces. Why didn't this catch on? Was there any reason behind it? Maybe I won't find any information, but I certainly think it's something to read up about, because it's interesting when people have these ideas of the future, and they were spot on. They had exactly the right idea, so why didn't we then think, oh great, let's move it on a stage? It's time to meet our guest for today. No expert, but I think this is important from time to time to get a client perspective, because that's probably you. You're going into this, you're in your early stages, researching what you might want to do, or maybe some way into the build, but just to be reassured from people who have been through the process and survived it. So Tahir is a successful businessman, and he wanted to build his own energy efficient home, which would be perfect for his family. So we'll hear all about how he got on as he nears the end of the process.
HousePlanningHelp.com. The interview.
I'm here with Tahir Sharif, and today I'm hoping this should be quite interesting, because Tahir has had his own house commissioned, but he's been very active and involved. So let's say hello first of all.
Hi.
What was in your mind, first of all, when you started in this process, compared to the house that, as we look across the field, we can see just up there now? So have you ended up with what you expected, or have you been on a journey?
Well, our expectations changed a lot through the course of the planning process, and just different iterations of the plans as we went through, because it's taken quite a long time to get here. We started on this in 2005, December 2005. So it's almost 7 years. And in those 7 years, we've had our battles with the planning people. We've also had some internal issues as to the form of the house, how it was going to be laid out. So yes, there's been lots and lots of change. But the initial expectation was that we'd end up with something that was beautiful, something that worked for us as a family, and something that would take very little lighting and heating. And I think we've achieved that.
So tell us about how it came about, how you've got to that position now, the challenges that you've had in your build.
How we got here, I guess, was we bought this farm. There was a house here. The house was probably at the worst location in the plot possible. It's at the lowest point. There's a stream running just by it. There's a well just outside the front door. And so it's just surrounded by damp. And it's got very bad damp course. So the whole house is full of damp. It's a poor floor plan. It just didn't make economic sense to try and make this any better. So as soon as we realised that, we knew that we wanted a new house. So when we decided we wanted a new house, our previous experience of houses was your general 30s suburban, either semis and terraced, and my mum and dad have got a big detached 30s house, but mostly quite dark, mostly poorly insulated, mostly compromised in a lot of ways. So what we wanted to achieve was something that was well lit all the time, something that was flexible enough in its layout that we could use it as a family, and then once the kids had left, we'd still feel comfortable in it. We wouldn't have to move because we've got this huge house and it just sort of feels empty. I mean, it is quite a large house. So one of the things that we were conscious of all the way through was that we didn't want to end up in a position where we were in our 60s or 70s and would have to move out because we couldn't afford the upkeep.
Is this when Passive House was introduced to you? And how did you react to it? How did you learn about it? And what finally convinced you to go ahead with it?
We never had Passive House as a target ourselves. John, the architect, has built stuff that's very near Passive House. I think he might have built one that's actually certified Passive House, but he'd never built a Passive House at this point when he was designing this house. And the engineer, Alan Clark, was quite keen to see us go for Passive House, but I had no problem with it not being Passive House. In fact, it's not going to be Passive House because we've just had our last air test last week and we came in above the level that's required for Passive House. Our main objective was to end up with a comfortable house, and the principles of Passive House made sense. So whether we achieved it or not, we were going to adopt that methodology. And it made sense to me because you're not bolting on lots of kit to provide extra energy. You're doing things to mitigate your energy usage. So, for example, in a normal house, if we had the daylighting levels that we've got in our house, you'd probably need an air conditioning system to extract the extra solar gain. But in this house, because it's been designed from the outset to deal with that level of sunlight, it's not a problem. And those were the things that appealed to us. One of the big influences, apart from John, on the project was Nick Grant, who's a director of the AECB. And every time I spoke to him about it, he said, invest as much as you can into the envelope of the building, into the structure of the building. That's what you want to do. Don't buy kit, don't invest in grey water, don't invest in renewables, don't invest in any of that stuff because you've got no need. You're on main sewage anyway. We're on main services all the way around, so there's no issue with that. It's not like we're in the middle of Scotland with no electric mains or anything like that, where, yeah, it would make sense to have your own PV and wind turbine and whatever. And so from the government's perspective, we have the Code for Sustainable Homes, which awards points for eco features in your house. And we found it quite difficult to meet code level 4 because we were investing in the wrong place as far as code is concerned. If we'd invested in kit, we would have found it very easy to comply with code level 4. But because we were investing in the fabric of the building, stuff that's going to last forever and isn't going to break down, unfortunately, that didn't really help us with code. So to get through code, we've had to do things like we're going to have to install bat boxes and bird boxes and stuff like that, which is insane when we're going to have a house that's way beyond anything that current building regs can even imagine in terms of efficiency and performance. And then you've got the industry, and the industry basically just wants to sell you more kit. So when you've got the two things in conjunction, I mean, for example, talking about the industry, the first mechanical engineer that we employed on the job came to their first meeting with us with folders full of brochures for solar PV, solar thermal, wind turbines of all sorts, ground source heat pumps, everything that you could think of. And, you know, after our first meeting, I told them not to bother to come back because, you know, they obviously were there just to sell kit and we weren't in that market. So, as the consumer, at the moment, you really need to understand yourself how a building can perform and what the implications are. You can't rely necessarily on government or industry to guide you sensibly, which is a shame, but it is the fact. I guess you could say we were lucky, but on the other hand, we spent a long time talking to people before we chose any particular direction in terms of how we were going to build. There was the AECB, which was very, very useful. And also, John, the architect, was very pragmatic. He didn't really want to push us one way or another, but he did have experience of low energy building. He did have experience of low impact building.
So maybe while we're on this subject, you chose John Broome Architects, but how did you make that choice? Was it a connection? I know that it's very important to try and create a team that you think you can work with. Yes,
basically, Nick Grant from the AECB recommended John. We interviewed 4 different architects. 3 of them had eco experience. 1 of them did not. None of them had really done the kind of project that we've ended up with. So we had to sort of take a stab in the dark, really. And what we decided was that we knew that we were in for a long-term relationship, because at the time we thought 2 or 3 years would be a long-term relationship, but we were anticipating at least a 2 or 3 year relationship with the architect. And we wanted to be comfortable with that person for that period. And that's the way that it did work with John. We've got no issues with John. We've been very comfortable discussing any kind of issue with him, small or large. He's always been accessible, and he's never tried to impose anything on you, which I think a lot of eco people will try and do. They're very. Some of them can be very, very dogmatic and say that their way is the only way. And I think you've got to be aware of that too. I mean, it's not easy whichever way you go. So you do have to have trust in your team to actually guide you, but you've still got to build up your own knowledge, and you do have to know enough to have an opinion about things. You have to know enough to be able to make a case for what you think is right. Because at the end of the day, whatever the architect thinks, whatever the building regs think, whatever anybody else thinks, it's going to be your house and you're going to live there.
So how? That's the question. How do you build up your knowledge?
How do you build up your knowledge? By talking to people is mostly how I built up my knowledge.
So like I'm doing here will help increase knowledge?
Absolutely. I mean, dialogue. The thing is, we took every opportunity to visit other people that had built similar houses. I can't remember the number of window suppliers, for example, that I visited. We were at EcoBuild every year for 6 or 7 years. anywhere where we could go and talk to people, we were talking to people. So the thing is, be brave, go out there and talk to people is the best way to do it. There are other places on the internet where you can actually learn that. I think there's one called the Green Building Forum, isn't there? But no, I mean, the AECB for me was the main one, and then there were books. I had a shelf load of books on eco building that I'd read.
Did you disagree with any of that as you went through?
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, for example, one of the building techniques that we looked at was structural hempcrete. So basically you have what's in effect a stud wall, and then you spray lime and hemp concrete onto it, and that forms your structural wall. And the claims being made for this were immense, and it just sounded too good to be true. So I did some research, I spoke to people, and I couldn't find anybody that agreed with the data. So therefore, I discarded that as an option. In the end, we've gone for what's a very simple structure, not using any fancy materials really at all. It's mostly off-the-shelf stuff, and it works.
Let's talk a little bit about the planning permission and the number of times that you went through this, because I'm still unclear myself, and maybe you can shed some light on your experience of going through the planning process, having had this house that's got a lot of mould in that we're sitting in, that's probably disintegrating as we speak, compared to your new house just up the hill.
The biggest objection that I have to our planning system is that it's adversarial in its nature, and also that it's very, very subjective. So when I say adversarial, for example, I've got a friend who lives in Switzerland, and he built a new house in 2006. He bought his plot in 2005. He'd moved in by the end of 2006. And when I used to talk to him about my house, he used to laugh at me because he basically bought his plot. He went to see the local planning department. They told him the parameters within which he could build. They said, okay, well, this is your plot size. This is the maximum size of house you can build. This is the maximum ridge height you can have. This is how far it's got to be away from boundaries, so on and so forth. And this is the environmental performance that we expect it to achieve. And he went off and did that. And he said that basically, as long as you're not doing anything too outlandish, it's just a process. You take your architect's plans into the planning office, they rubber stamp them, and that's it. Off you go and build. Over here, the planning office will not tell you anything. They will not say, okay, well, you can build a 320 square metre house or a 200 square metre house or a 500 square metre house. Their approach is put something in, and then if we knock it back, then you know that that's not acceptable. Which is a bit pointless, isn't it? Because you've spent money on architects, you've spent time, you've done all of that. So why make it like that? But that's the way that it is. But there's an added layer of complication in here, because this is where subjectivity comes into it, because every individual planning officer has their own view on things. So when we started our dialogue with the planning office, we spent 18 months talking to the planning office before we put our first set of plans in. And we thought we'd ironed out all the issues. Unfortunately, when the application went in, it was dealt with by a completely different planning officer who took a completely different view. Even fundamental things like where on the plot we were going to be allowed to build were changed. So it just doesn't work. It's probably works if you're a commercial planner and you're building a development of 100 houses, then yeah, I think they're probably going to give you much stricter guidelines at the start of, well, this is what you're going to be able to achieve. And the fact is that as a big developer, you've got the legal fees to throw at it, you've got the professionals in-house, you've got everything that you need in order to be able to deal with it. But for us, what this ended up in was 18 months of dialogue, 6 months of design and engineering. So 2 years overall before we submitted, and then it got rejected, which was gutting, really, because we had done everything we thought by the book. We'd gone absolutely within every parameter that the planning officer had suggested, and because it was going to be in a more noticeable position in the field, it was going to be quite a complicated structure that was going to allow for 6 foot of field to go over it. It needed a lot of engineering work. We lost a lot of money on that, apart from the time. The money was just amazing. And the other thing is that there is no magic bullet here. You can talk to planning consultants. Some people think that, particular architects in a particular area have an inside track to the planning department. I don't believe in any of that. There's no magic formula here. You've just got to keep battling and just be pragmatic. At the end, you've got to achieve what you've got to achieve. So if they say that for whatever reason it's got to be 3 metres smaller, then go for 3 metres smaller, unless you're really prepared to put in an appeal and go through all of that.
I would certainly like to build my own house before I'm 40. Mm-hmm. So in conclusion, maybe you could just pull together 3 tips or 3 useful things that I might find on my path. It doesn't necessarily have to be connected with energy efficiency. It could be the whole process as being someone who wants a house built and coming into that fairly green and then learning along the way.
I think the most important thing is to learn as much as you can about building a house and about how you want to live in that house. Going back to Nick at the AECB, one of the recommendations that he made to me was to read a book called A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander. And that's primarily about how people interact with spaces. And we use that to inform our floor plan quite a bit. Because I'm a firm believer that whatever kind of house you build, it has to be a working, functional home first, before it's eco or before it's mud brick or before it's whatever else it is. That's the first principle of building a house. Build something that is going to work and is going to be desirable. Because if you build a pile of poop, then somebody else is going to come along, knock it down and start again. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, as much as you can, assemble a team that you really believe in, whether that's engineers, architects, builders, whoever that you're going to encounter along the way. Get people that you really think that you believe in and that you're going to be able to work with over a long period, because it probably will take longer than you anticipated. And if you've got any doubts about whether you're going to be able to get on with somebody, then just don't go there. We only had one person on this job that we didn't get on with, and that was the structural engineer, and he was the one that let us down in the end. So from our experience, be aware that you've got to get on with your team. And the third thing, I guess, is you've got to be determined. I mean, it's whether you go for an eco build or whether you've got just a normal house in mind, you will have setbacks. It will cost more than you thought. It will take longer than you thought. And the thing is, you've got to be able to plough on through, keep calm and carry on.
Tahir, thank you very much for all your advice and for chatting to me today.
Thank you.
I do find it incredible how you spend all of this time building up your knowledge, and when you get to the end, you'll probably never use it ever again. Tahir is a businessman, he doesn't build houses, and he's got all that knowledge. Maybe he can advise friends when they come round. But also we heard another planning story. I must admit, most of the stories I hear about the UK planning system are not good. If you're listening elsewhere in the world, I would like to know what you do. We've heard some examples from Holland and Switzerland that perhaps things go through a little more quickly. How does it work with you? Are you similar to the UK or to the rest of Europe? And we've got some feedback as well. Let's read some bits out from Facebook. Hi to Sam Adams in Brighton, who left us a message saying, just signed up to your podcast, really enjoyed your chat with Ted. That was the last session, Ted Stevens. Also, Penny Poyser has been on Twitter. I'm trying to retrofit a city garden plot in Broxtowe, Nottingham. The estate was designed on Garden City lines. Again, this is referring back to our last chat that we had with Ted, and I'm hoping to go and visit Penny and to check out that place. And also, well done to Paul Stewart from the Energy Technology Hub, who worked out how to use our voicemail feature. He became the first person to find it on the website. You can leave us a voicemail message at any time, and it is possible it's something that we can even feature into the podcast if you've got something really good to say that everyone else will benefit from as well. Now, next time, I would like to do another client interview, but I'm only going to do that if it's with someone outside the UK and you are building an eco home, or you've built one and you took the fabric first approach. If that's you listening now, get in touch and perhaps we can do an interview over the internet. That would be really good. But I've got something else lined up. If not, we'll be looking at retrofitting a Victorian house, so period properties, on the next session.
You've been listening to Ben Adam Smith on the path to build a better home. Sign up now to the free email newsletter. Head to houseplanninghelp.com.